here today. I wanted to talk about using citizen science to measure environmental pollution. There's been quite a lot about citizen science. You know, it's become a very popular thing to do these days, and there's kind of a push to kind of get involved and to engage the public with your research, and citizen science it's quite an interesting mechanism to do that. It's also obviously working with people and asking people to collect data for you comes with its own problems and its own challenges. So what I wanted to do today is really think about how to design citizen science projects and what I can share from my learnings from being involved in 2 citizen science projects. And hopefully that is quite a lot of self-reflection in this. Hopefully that will kind of help people if they want to design something, or if they want to kind of go out, engage with the public and get the public involved in measuring environmental pollution. I should say that I think it's a lot of effort doing citizen science with people, but it does, in my view, it's definitely worth it in terms of building connections and building trust with the public. Not only that, but also obviously it gives you a way of collecting data that you wouldn't otherwise be able to collect. So there's kind of the two kind of aspects in terms of building connections and kind of showing the scientific process to people at the same time as getting data that otherwise just would be impossible to get. So the 2 projects I'd like to share with you today are Bib Breathes. Bib Breathes is a large study, and it's looking at the effect of the Bradford Clean Air Zone on health and well-being. It's very topical this week because the Bradford Clean Air Zone came into force on Tuesday of this week. So it's like other clean air zones. It's kind of an area across the city where certain categories of cars and vehicles are charged to enter the city centre with the aim of reducing air pollution within the city centre. So what Bib Breathes does is Bib Breathes is aiming to really examine the effect of the clean air zone across the whole city. So not just on air pollution, but also on people's health, children's health, and also looking at the social and economic impacts of the clean air zone. The second study I'll talk about today is a much, much smaller study. It's called Homes Under the Microscope, and it's looking at airborne microplastics in the home. So this is a very new topic. It's not something that there's a lot of data on particularly. And so we wanted to use a citizen science approach for this study because we're really interested in people's homes, and we want to characterize airborne microplastics in the home. And you can't really do that in a normal home without engaging the people that live in those homes. So I'll talk first about Bib Breathes. As I said, Bradford Clean Air Zone is now live. And so it was a little bit delayed. It was due to take place about a year ago, but with COVID and everything like that, it's a little bit behind schedule, but it's now in place. And Bib Breathes is looking at the economic and societal impacts of it. A big part of Bib Breathes is looking at the children's health in the 3 years before and the 3 years after the clean air zone. So they aren't going to do this using citizen science. They're going to do this using a statistical approach, looking at admissions to hospital, things like that. So that's kind of the main bulk of the study. And then the children's exposure to air pollution is the bit that we were using a citizen science approach in. So that's the part that I'm involved in. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to get an understanding of the extent to which the children's exposure to air pollution changes as effect of the clean air zone. So the clean air zone, it's kind of a step change in the amount of pollution in the city. So we wanted to be able to measure before the clean air zone and after the clean air zone, characterize the amount of pollution that children are exposed to, and understand when they're exposed to that pollution, understand if they get higher exposure at school or at home, a higher exposure during the commute, things like that. So we wanted to be able to kind of really dig into where children are being exposed to air pollution and the effect of the clean air zone on this. Before I talk about the design of Bib Breathes, I wanted to just highlight the fact that one of the aspects of Bib Breathes is really looking and kind of connecting with people in what they call seldom heard communities. So these are people that tend to live in relatively poor environments. They might lack the confidence to be involved in something like kind of going to a town meeting. They would never kind of write to their MP or something like that. They're generally people that are slightly disenfranchised, or not easy, kind of people that are living in kind of relatively deprived areas, might not speak English as a first language. And so what Barn and Bradford does very well is it uses the community links that it's got to go and specifically target different groups of people that might not otherwise be represented So one of the things they've done with the Clean Air Zone is they've gone to people and they've held a whole series of focus groups, and they've asked people about their opinions on air pollution and their opinions on the Clean Air Zone. And there's a few things that I kind of wanted to highlight. One of the things is that came out of that discussion is that although people are worried about air pollution, it's not necessarily their most important pollution that they're interested in. A lot of people said they were more worried about fly tipping. It's a much more visible pollution, smelly, it's ugly, it kind of brings down the whole neighbourhood. People who were aware that Bradford has kind of areas which have got high pollution and areas which have got low pollution. So people were aware of the imbalance, basically, of the exposure between children living in one area with kind of leafy streets and living in the city centre. And then the other thing that a lot of people raise is simply that people that don't have a lot of money are having to make really, really difficult decisions about, this quote is, I have to decide if I should eat or pay the bills, where they're wrong people to ask about these things. So although it's known that air pollution is a problem throughout Bradford, it's not necessarily at the forefront of everybody's minds because obviously people have other things to think about. So we were kind of very aware of this in terms of the background of how we designed the project and the communities that we wanted to engage with and the children that we wanted to work with. But we did come up with quite an ambitious measurement plan. We decided that we wanted to measure in 12 different schools in Bradford. Every school we put in 3 static monitors. So these are measured PM 2.5, so particulate matter pollution, 2 indoor sensors and 1 outdoor sensor. We also did some NOx diffusion tubes, and that's the static monitoring. So we put those in schools, and the idea was that it would stay monitoring for the full time period. We also wanted to get children's exposure, and we can only really do that by attaching a sensor to a child and letting the child do whatever the child wants to do. And we decided to do this by doing kind of set observational periods. So we had, over a single observation period, we'd have 5 children at each of the 12 schools carrying a sensor for a week. And then the next week, a different 5 children from the same class would carry it, and that would go over 5 weeks in total. So any one point in time during the intensive observation period, we'd have 5 children over 12 schools in Bradford doing some measurement. The portable sensors, what they did is the kids took them home at night, so they carried them on the commute, which is the bit of the day that we were most interested in. But then they took them into the classroom the next day. Sensors were put to charge during the day, but it also meant that the sensors, for each school, the sensors were measuring the same air. And so we were able to intercompare the data from the sensors looking at that. So we can kind of use that to identify any sensors that aren't behaving, basically. This is just a little schematic, kind of an approximate schematic of what we wanted to do. We had 6 intensive observation periods, 3 before the Clean Air Zone, 3 after, and then the static monitoring kind of giving us a background concentration for the full time. Unfortunately for us, it was pretty bad timing in terms of COVID. We planned to do quite a lot of our observation towards the end of the first lockdown of COVID, and obviously schools were closed. And unluckily for us as well, labs were closed, and we'd planned to build a lot of the sensors ourselves. We had the code and we had the kind of the experience of building the sensors, but we just couldn't get into the labs to do that. So we decided to kind of change tack quite early on in the project, and instead of building our own static sensors, the first thing we did is we bought a pile of commercially available static sensors. So these are the Purple Air sensors. Purple Air are actually, I think they're a really nice little sensor. They've got 2 PMS sensors. They're called the actual sensors inside them are super cheap, but they're wrapped together in a nice little in a unit. These are about $250. They run 2 cheap sensors side by side and take the average, but you can also look at the data from each individual sensor. So if something goes wrong with one of them, it's pretty obvious. The other thing they do is they've got a really nice web interface. So this is just a screenshot from the other day. Each circle is a sensor, is an outdoor PM 2.5 sensor. The ones in Bradford are all at schools. You can see that some of them are grey. This means that there's a sensor there that has connected to the internet at some point in time, but isn't currently connected to the internet. And this is something we've had quite a lot, is the fact that Wi-Fi outside schools is not particularly good. Every time someone changes the Wi-Fi password, we have to go back and reconfigure our sensor to talk to the internet. So we're finding it's quite patchy in terms of the data, but that is more of a kind of a Wi-Fi problem. They do have SD cards, so they do write the data, so we shouldn't have lost it. So when we go back and change the Wi-Fi and reconfigure, it will all get uploaded to the internet, and we find that has been quite reliable. So this is just as an idea of some of the data that we're getting from these sensors. This is a time series. I've taken 1 day average PM2.5 concentrations, and that's to kind of average out the kind of the local variability or the events that each sensor will get exposed to. Each line in these is PM2.5 data from a different school. And what you can see basically is that the sensors are all giving quite similar data. So they're able to pick up the large scale variability in air pollution, which is mostly caused by meteorology. And so because the sensors are kind of all giving quite similar results and a similar pattern of results, I'm fairly confident that they're reporting kind of quite reasonable values. The next step for this obviously is to compare to some of the Bradford Council PM2.5 sites and check that they're in line with those. So once, once we were able to access some of our labs, because we got all the equipment for static sensors, we decided we should go and build them, and that would give us some additional sensors in schools. This is the design that we had wanted to use for the static sensors. So this is an AlphaSense optical particle counter. We chose those because it doesn't just give PM2.5 data, it gives information of the size distribution of the aerosol distribution, which is quite useful to know if you're trying to understand where the aerosols come from. So these are about £100 each. And I have to say that we really struggled to use them. They took a long time for us to get them connected up to the Pi, and we found they were quite breakable. We got quite a lot of them, and quite a few didn't behave fairly early on. So we decided that we needed a backup. And so we bought some Senseron sensors. These are these little green boxes. These, if you buy a pile of them, they're about £25 each. They're very, very easy to use. They're good for hobbyists, apart from anything else. People that kind of like playing with Raspberry Pis. They don't come with a particularly easy wire to use. That's my only criticism of them. But once you've kind of sorted out the wiring, we plugged it all in together, and actually they seem to be quite reliable. Also got temperature and relative humidity sensors. So one of the things we wanted to do with the data is really understand what drives indoor air pollution in schools, and to what extent outdoor air pollution drives indoor air concentrations. We're still really digging into this, but this is just a little snapshot. We had an undergraduate student, Megan, who looked at this. And what you can see here, the blue line is outdoor air concentrations, air quality concentrations, and red is indoor. And you can see there's definitely a correlation here in quite a lot of the time period, although it does break down sometimes. But generally, the indoor concentration is kind of buffered, a lower version of the outdoor concentration. But there's definitely a pattern. So we're going to kind of look into this to see what extent that's replicated across the 12 schools. Moving on from the static onto the personal exposure sensors, again, we were kind of, we'd planned to build our own, and we planned to have the same design as the statics, so a Raspberry Pi and the OPC, and but this time with a battery pack and a little GPS module. And we built them, and obviously we couldn't really test them because everything was closed, but we built a few of them. So I roped my kids into doing it. This is them with their lockdown haircuts, doing a little bit of durability testing to see whether they'd survive a trip to the park. And the basic answer was they just didn't. They were just too, the OPC was just too fragile to use as a portable sensor. Which is kind of fine because it wasn't designed as a portable sensor, it wasn't sold as a portable sensor, so I can't get too annoyed about that, but it definitely wasn't suitable for our purpose. The next best thing would have been to try to just swap it out, maybe use a Senseron or one of the other low-cost PM2.5 sensors available. But what we found is, although we could do that technology, we really struggled with the casing, to get a casing that worked, that you could attach to a child, that was easy enough to open, that you could kind of charge stuff and charge the battery, but hard enough to open that the kids wouldn't open it. So we struggled with the casing, and we just basically ran out of time. And so we decided to change tack. We hadn't bought enough kit for all the portable sensors yet. So we decided to spend our money elsewhere and basically go and buy some commercially available portable sensors. And we went for the AtmoTube Pro. There's a couple of different devices on the market. I don't really know whether this is the best one that we could have chosen, but it's the one that we went for. They're about £160 each. They measure PM1, PM2.5, PM10. They say they measure VOCs, but we haven't really looked into it, and also temperature and relative humidity. And the way that they work is they take measurements every couple of seconds, but then they only give you a time average value every minute. So they're not ideal for very short commutes, which a lot of our children have. A lot of our children live very close to school. And the other thing that's just weird about them is they only give integer values. So if you're looking, it seems a bit coarse, especially at low PM concentrations, you know, they're getting a value of 2 or 3, not 2.5. They work they're battery powered. You can charge them with a USB, and they have Bluetooth on them. So what we did is we gave the kids a phone with Bluetooth connectivity, which they put in the bum bag. AtmoTube Pro was hanging outside the bum bag. The AtmoTube Pro takes data, passes it to the phone, and then when the phone is within Wi-Fi, it uploads it to a server. The phone can also get GPS data because the phones should know where they are. So that was good. We kind of spent a long time getting the kit together, wanted to get the kids involved, really excited. And we found that when we were going to school, we got loads of enthusiasm from the kids. They really wanted to take part, but we had really, really low rate for the permission forms. Obviously, we need parental consent if we want to take measurements with the children. So we had to kind of go back into schools and really, really push and explain that we needed, if they wanted to take part, we needed these forms back. So we did, Bourne and Bradford staff did a lot of schools visit. They did some kind of easy, this is air pollution talks, did some media. We edited it, we'd already got a video, but we edited it to make it really clear to parents that they needed to fill in the permission form. We re-recorded it, and we went back to Bourne and Bradford and asked, you know, who from BIB can speak the different languages of Bradford, and we re-recorded it in 5 different languages. And so by doing that, we'd really realized that we needed to make it much more accessible, and those were the steps we took. Then finally, we got the kids on board, got the equipment, went out to measure, and at the end of the first week, we could have cried, frankly. There was so little data. It was very, very patchy. And we really kind of had to kind of think about what was going on. It looked like a lot of the AtmoTubes had been turned off quite early. And then we realized that the AtmoTube basically comes with this lovely friendly button on the front of it, which if you're 10 years old is just an invite to go and press it. So we think the kids probably turned it off, turned it on again, turned it off, and then didn't turn it on again. And so actually they were, for the first week at least, they were walking around with turned off sensors for quite a fraction of the time. So we came up with this really high-tech solution of just sticking a sticker on saying, please don't turn off the button. And actually that worked. In subsequent weeks, we got much better coverage from the AtmoTubes. One thing which didn't work very well was the GPS on the phones. We ended up having to buy new phones. We just couldn't get the phones that we'd originally got talking to get location data in the GPS, which was a bit frustrating. But anyway, this is the measurement I showed earlier. This is what we were planning to do. And this is what we've actually ended up doing. We were obviously delayed. We couldn't have measured when the schools were closed. We were late starting. We're pleased that we got some static stuff in fairly early on. And we did 3 observational periods. The first one, the first week, is pretty poor data, but then it gets much better. And so because the clean air zone was delayed as well, what we've done is we've ended up with 3 measuring periods before the clean air zone. So we're still looking at the data. The data is very noisy, it should be said. I mean, obviously you've got like kind of 30, 40 kids that are all doing different things across Bradford at any one point in time. It's hard to interpret that data. Thankfully, we have a PhD student, Aisha, who's looking into it. And this is one of the first plots that she's come up with. And so for this, each line is one of the 3 intensive observation periods. And then she's plotted the average concentration across all the kids, all the schools, just within that particular time category. And what you see is at least a little bit encouraging, is that you tend to find between kind of 9 to 2, you tend to find this kind of slightly flatter, lower concentration when the children are in school, and then it rises as soon as the children go out of school, which is what we'd expect. So we see these higher concentrations kind of early afternoon as the children are leaving school, and also that's kind of replicated as well in the morning with the morning commute. Finally, one thing that's really important with citizen science is to remember why people, so as a scientist, I'm gaining from these people's time. I'm gaining, you know, my research questions are being answered, my career is being recognized for the fact I'm doing this, and we're asking people for their time. And so it's really important to understand, A, why people have agreed to take part, and so what do they want out of it? And even if that's not clear, it's really important to make sure that you can kind of guess, to make sure they get something out of it. So for every child that took part, they got an individualized report which summarized their data. Some of them, it was quite patchy, there wasn't a lot of data, but some of them, it was a bit more coherent. But we did explain, and I think that's really important to just explain the fact that initially the sensors didn't work very well, and then we fixed this and we changed this, and that's part of the scientific process, and that we're learning when we're doing this. We've never done this before. We don't know what the results are going to be, and we've learned through doing this. And your time in taking part in this has helped us learn. And so for us, that's I think a very important message. The other thing we did is we worked with this organization called Eye for Creativity. We teach creativity in schools. They're a really great organization. They do really fun, interactive workshops. And they've done a lot of workshops across Leeds and Bradford on air pollution. And so they kind of get some experts in. So we've kind of been the expert teaching about air pollution. And then they get the kids to come up with solutions around, you know, how would you solve air pollution? And then selected kids from some of the schools got to go and present their ideas. This is Bradford has a very grand town hall. This is within the Bradford Town Hall, and these are kind of community leaders and staff from Airbourne and Bradford. So the kids got to present their data. So hopefully we made the connection between people that don't necessarily have that much of a voice in community that often, to allow the children to kind of go to the town hall and speak to the council and say, we've done this, we've learned this, this is our idea. So hopefully through that we kind of helped the children grow a little bit in confidence that their voice can be heard, or should be heard at least. So there was a lot that we did. There was a lot, frankly, that went wrong, but there was quite a lot that went right. In retrospect, it was a very, very complex design. It's the kind of thing that perhaps we should have thought more about the logistics earlier on. Just delivering equipment to 12 schools across Bradford is very time consuming. The COVID, you know, we couldn't have anticipated, but it did get in the way. We're very aware that we're reliant on the goodwill of the schools and the teachers. And although we do feel we gave something back to the kids, I don't know if it was enough, and certainly not to the teachers, because the teachers are already super busy. Plus COVID made teaching very hard. And then we additionally asked, so there's a whole discussion as to what extent people should be even paid or rewarded in some way for being a participant in the citizen science study. And that effort should be reflected somewhere. It's not just free effort. And that's something I'd really look into, certainly with working in schools in the future, because school budgets are so tight at the moment. Yeah, I learned that not every mobile phone has good GPS. I thought that mobile phones tracked you wherever you went, but not these ones. In terms of sensor, purple layers seem really reliable as long as the Wi-Fi is okay. Wi-Fi is not always great, but you know, they seem okay. The other thing that's kind of really obvious, I know lots of people here have gone to like really remote places to measure stuff, but the classrooms are pretty rough places. When we picked up some of the sensors, it was clear that some of them had been kicked with a football or knocked off a shelf, or lots of them got switched off. So you have to be aware that there's going to be a lot of data missing from any time series in a school. The AmmoTube Pro, now in terribly bad timing, we're now looking at the data from that AmmoTube Pro and doing a lot of comparisons for the instruments to see if we can understand whether they're doing a good enough job. So we're doing a lot of testing now to check the data, and hopefully that will help us interpret the data that we've collected. So that was Bib Breeds, and then moving on to a much smaller and simpler study, Homes Under the Microscope. It is just a citizen science study. It was funded through a citizen science call, and the call asked for people who would put together a group of researchers that didn't necessarily have that much experience in citizen science. So there's a kind of a few people within the team that have done citizen science before, lots of people that haven't. And then part of the idea of the project is really about us understanding as researchers what works, what doesn't work. And we're using this really novel kind of a topic to apply and to learn from. So I should say I've never worked in microplastics before. Until I met Ben at a conference, I'd not ever really thought about microplastics at all. But we all know that we weigh tons of plastic in the environment, absolutely tons. When you think of plastic in the home, you tend to think of bottles and food packaging and things like that. But 2/3 of the clothes, the textiles in our home contain plastic. And as we're wearing these textiles, as we move around, what happens is tiny little fragments break off and go into the air around us. And this is pretty well known that when you wash clothes, that tiny microfragments, microfibers break off and go into the wash. But what's less well known is what passes into the air. There's only a few studies. So there's a study by DeFalco et al., in which they basically, as far as I understand, they basically had a clean room and they got someone wearing just normal clothes to hang around in the clean room and do some exercise. And they measured the amount of microfibers coming off the clothes within that clean room. And what they realized is the amount of fibers released to the air is actually not dissimilar to the amount of fibers that are released when you wash clothes. But as yet, to my knowledge, there's not any policy that covers, in terms of designing clothes and designing textiles, there's not any policy that covers how much microfibers can be released to the air. So there's no incentive really for textile manufacturers to try and reduce it. The other thing with this as a topic is the fact that it really is a very new topic. There's very few, so the proposal for this was quite easy to write because it's easy to say, look, we just don't have very many observations of this. People have found microplastics all over the world, but actually there's very few measurements within the home environment. And we don't know, we know that these fibers are breaking off from our clothes. And so it makes sense that there should be this background of microfibers in the environment, in the air that is in our homes, but there's so few studies of it. So we built our homes around this kind of lack of measurement. And it was really easy to make a citizen science case because we want to measure in real people's homes. And so for that, you need to engage people. One thing we've done with homes, which is kind of came out of some of the learning from the breeds, is that we've done a very extensive pilot. And with the pilots, we deliberately targeted what we call people that are likely to give high engagement. So what we realized is that we want ultimately to engage with people from a really broad background, a really broad spectrum of people. We don't want anyone to feel that they can't be engaged or that the barrier to engagement is too high. But in order to design a citizen science experiment where that is true, we really need a lot of feedback from the public in the design, so that we decided to kind of try and co-create the experiment with our pilot participants. So we deliberately recruited 40 people who we felt that are confident in speaking up, good with science, happy to play with microscopes, happy to play with tools, happy to give the time to fill in a really long survey, things like that. So we were quite selective in who we went for, but it's actually worked really, really well. So we've got 40 participants for the pilot. Each of them tested 4 different microscopes, and they've given us, we've asked them a lot. They've filled out 3 separate feedback forms. So it was a big ask for the pilot. And where we are now is that the pilot's just complete, and in the next couple of months, we're refining that, and then we'll run our main experiment. So the wider rollout is just going to be in Bristol and Bradford. And we're choosing just those 2 cities because we've already got community links within those cities. So I know Bradford through born in Bradford and having lived there. Everyone else knows Bristol because they live there. And we're aiming to use the connections that the kind of community links that we know to push out to kind of a very wide range of participants. We're aiming for about 120 people, but is much, much lighter touch than the pilot. So we're fairly optimistic. And the other thing that we want to do with homes is we want to build a dialogue between people that use textiles, which is obviously all of us, and people that make textiles and people that develop policy around this. So we really we're trying to engage people on the subject, and then once they're engaged, again, provide a mechanism that they can give their views to someone that could make a difference in the future. So to kind of start a dialogue about this project, because there really is there will be in future legislation around this, I'm sure. So it would be nice to kind of get people to feed into that legislation. In terms of sampling, it is possibly the simplest thing that you could imagine. In terms of what we've asked people to do is we've asked people to place these sample dishes in their homes. It's literally just a Petri dish with some forensic tape stuck to it. And then there's a clear cover over it, which we ask people to peel off. And that leaves it sticky side up on the Petri dish. So if you basically just ask people to leave it on a shelf for a couple of weeks, anything that falls out of the sky or the air in the room and lands on the forensic tape will stick to the forensic tape. So yeah, it's only a step away from just doing it with sellotape, basically. The only one thing that we've done is you can see these dots. These are actually letters, and the letters tell us where in the grid things are. And that's so we can match people's images that they've taken with microscopes to where it is in the dish, so we can then look at the particular fragment. So this is an example of what people have uploaded to us. We're not asking people to look for any particular part of the forensic tape. We'll just say take some photos. So obviously people take photos of the more interesting bits. So we tend to get photos of fibers. So this is kind of a long blue fiber here, pink fiber. The black dots are things that have deposited down. The kind of white grey background is just the tape. So we need to work out ways of identifying or taking that away from the image. Obviously, it means that we won't effectively collect. If there's something white drops on it, we'll think it's the tape. So there's a little bit of bias that we need to work on in terms of making sure that we're kind of collecting the information correctly, that we're not biased for particular colours. This is an example of our pilot participants doing it. You can see it takes a certain type of person to sit at a kitchen table, 4 different microscopes, and go through a wad of instructions to take part. But quite a lot of people said that they got their kids involved, or they got the wider family involved. So clearly it was quite encouraging, the fact that it is a difficult thing to take part in, but it seemed to go down fairly well. And so we asked everyone to test these 4 different microscopes, and for the future we'll choose the one that people said was easiest to use for the main experiment. The other thing we asked them to do is we asked them to take photos of their sample and then upload it to our website. And then on the website, we've got this little image processing tool. And what it does is it automatically looks to see whether it can count the number of fibers and the number of particulates that have fallen onto it. And this is kind of our hope. It's partly about kind of showing kind of quite a funky use of what data visualizing, of what image processing can do. And it's also a little bit about how can we scale this up? So we don't want to end up with 120 samples that we can't kind of automate the processing of, if you see what I mean. So hopefully this tool will be an example, will be a way of kind of speeding up the analysis process. But so far people were quite interested in looking at the imaging and what the imaging can do. So we're thinking of perhaps building some kind of schools activity in the future around this, and maybe linking it to the image analysis to kind of get kids involved in coding, but for quite a different reason. That's still in process. So one thing that obviously we can't tell from a microscope image, we can't tell what something's made of. So we can say that it's a microfiber, but we can't say that it's microplastic. So what people do is they take the samples, they put it in their home for 2 weeks, they take some microscope images of the sample, and then they post the sample back to us or down to Bristol, where they have a Raman microscope. And then what we can't, unfortunately, look at every sample in a huge amount of depth, because it is quite time consuming running a Raman spectra apparently. So what we do is we try and find the fiber that they took the image of and run the thing on that. And so we can give them personalized information to say, the blue fiber that you sent to us is cotton. The blue fiber that you sent to us is polyester, whatever it is, whatever it turns out to be. And then we can kind of say something generally about where those materials are used in the home more often. So where it might have come from. So as I said, we've just kind of got to the end of the pilot with this. So we're still kind of, we're still learning a little bit about, and we're still thinking about the design of the main experiment. What we are doing, what we found that has worked very, very well is because we focused on quite a small geographical area, we were able to, we'd originally said we'd post the kits out to people, but we ended up actually dropping them off. Well, people that live in Bristol ended up kind of dropping them off and collecting the kits in person. And that worked really, really well. People, especially at pickup time, at collection time, people have already filled in a really long form and given a lot of feedback, but we're finding that when they hand the kits back, they're giving a lot of informal feedback. And that's actually really, really useful feedback. And I think people are a little bit freer speaking in person than they would be filling in a form. So what we're finding is that is actually, although it's really time consuming, it's giving us a lot of additional information, which is great. The other thing is that it's allowing us to build really good relationships. So the fact that scientists has kind of come around to their house, picked up a sample, talked about the project, talked about and been willing to listen as well, been willing to listen to the participants' experience of doing the project has allowed us to build up good relationships. So you can see the emails coming in when people are asking questions about the project. They're informal because, you know, they've met most of the team already. And a lot of the people that have done the pilot are really happy to do the main experiment as well. But it is very time consuming. The other thing that we're really just beginning to get to grips with is, in terms of discussing with people, is that although it's a really easy topic in the fact that there needs to be measurements of this, there are very few, we are doing some measurements, that's a really easy message to explain. What's much harder is the fact that it is quite a complex topic in terms of what's good or bad for the environment. And also with health, there's very little understanding about what effects a kind of breathing microfibers or microplastics has on your health. And it's not the case that you can simply say plastic is bad, don't use plastic. Natural fibers obviously have large environmental footprint as well. They could also have health effects. Sometimes it's the dye that's used in fabrics which have health effects. Is actually really quite a complex topic. So what we need to think about and what we're struggling with at the moment is the people that tend to get engaged in these kind of things tend to be quite motivated by kind of helping the environment, which is great. But then it's not very helpful to be like, you know, the scientists are like, oh, it's not that simple, that people need to find this. But actually it isn't that simple. And so we need to find ways of communicating the kind of the pros and cons of different fibers and focusing on things that we can do something about, rather than just making a really broad brush. There's plastic in your clothes, plastic is bad, you know, kind of example. Apart from anything else, if we want to work with textile manufacturers who use plastic for reasons that they understand and know well, bridging that is quite delicate, and we're not totally sure how to do that. But it's something that we're working on. So just in terms of overall findings, hopefully this has given you a little bit of an overview of two citizen science projects. I should say citizen science is time consuming, but it's very fun. It's very rewarding. It's great to be able to kind of involve and engage people within the scientific process. On reflection, I think the most important things is really know your audience. So if you want to ask someone to give up time to help you with your research, you need to understand why they would want to take it this involved, how confident they are, what's their level of skill, what time do they have available. And you need to balance. If you're just asking something small, then perhaps, yeah, you'll get a lot of people. If you're asking something big, you're going to get much fewer people, and you're going to really need to think about which people you target. So just take time to kind of think about who you want to engage with. Obviously, point number two, anyone that's worked in the field, it doesn't need that said, but field tests, pilots, things like that are so important. We weren't able to do it as much as we wanted to with bib braids, and we had intended to, but you just can't anticipate what will go wrong. And so that's why that's really important. It is very time consuming, involves going to people's houses, it involves kind of involves speaking to people, it involves building relationships. All these things take quite a lot of time. So yeah, don't underestimate the time required to do it. And then finally, it's important to consider what people get out of it and to make sure that it's a positive experience for people. So follow up afterwards with personalized information, a thank you postcard, an update. Don't leave it a year and say, look, we've published this paper, thanks. Follow up with something that people will actually mean something to them. And so trying to work out, again, going back to thinking why someone took part, and then kind of try and answer that question for them. You maybe probably can't, say, look, we've solved this big scientific problem, but what you can say is, we've learned this is how you contributed, we're really grateful for your time. And I think that's very essential, because you want to make sure it's a positive experience for people that have taken part. And that's kind of a really good way. If you just disappear after you've got what you want, then that leaves a bit of a bad taste. So yeah, that's something to build into the design of any citizen science study. And that's it. That's my thinkings in citizen science.
Thank you, Kirsty. That was fantastic. A really nice mix of citizen science and sensors, and how it's hard to work with both. And you tried to do both, so well done.
Thank you. I've got more grey hairs now.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions that I'll pose to you now. So Claire Horwell first says great talk, and asks when it's going to be available on YouTube. We'll get it up. I don't know. John might be able to answer that for me, but hopefully within the next week or so. But Claire also asked, did you calibrate the sensors with reference grade instruments through co-location before and after the study?
We try to, yes. We've done quite a few. We're going to have to go back and do it again and more comprehensively. So we've done quite a lot. We spent a lot of time running all the sensors in the same like in a lab in Leeds with high grade sensors, and they performed pretty well. The ammo tubes we tested by just kind of hanging them out the window and leaving them in one place, and that would pile of ammo tubes per layer, and some higher grade instruments as well. We didn't do that kind of within the schools, if you see what I mean. So we did that before we took them to the schools, and we're doing it again much more comprehensively now. It would be good if we could get some high grade instruments into schools and kind of do that, but it's kind of more a question of access and how much we can ask for. We've got one school that's basically turning into a bit of a super site, and they have a flat roof with power on it, so it's like ideal for this kind of thing, and a really friendly teacher. So I think what we're going to do is we've already got a few extra bits and pieces up on that roof, so we will try and add things there and use that as a calibration. Obviously we should have probably done that before. But.
Great. Matt Cooper asks, on a technical note, did you consider using LoRaWAN for transmitting data rather than Wi-Fi, so you didn't have to deal with passwords?
We absolutely did, and there is a guy in Bradford who is a professor of this kind of stuff, and I spoke with him quite a lot, and it sounds like it would have been a really, really good solution, but we just didn't. We ran out of time, basically. I know that there's work going on in Sheffield around using what they call the Luftdaten ones, using LoRaWAN with them, and because they had exactly the same problem that, people put up the sensor, and as soon as the Wi-Fi password changes, they lose the data. So I think it would be a really good solution, and yeah, I'd be really interested to hear in the future, because it's frustrating. It's so time consuming to go back and change a password, and it's not the best use of time.
Yeah. I had a question about kind of, again, the sort of data transmission. So you gave all the kids a mobile phone. Like, how did you decide that was the best way to do the geolocation? Would it, was that the sort of most cost-effective solution?
Pretty much, yeah. So what we did is we gave them a phone that was turned on but locked with a horrendous passwords, so we were pretty confident that they couldn't unlock them. This is when we were in the hands of Bourne and Bradford, really, because they know what is kind of you can do. We weren't, so in our original thing, we had a Pi 0 with a little GPS. It's just a USB GPS, and that worked quite well. We could have maybe tried to run something like that alongside the AtmoTube, but we kind of needed the phone for the AtmoTube to get the data across anyway. So yeah, that was kind of, we figured, well, if we need a phone anyway, we may as well use the phone for the GPS. What really surprised me was that the phone GPS was really, really poor. It seems to be Android phones in particular, they go into sleep mode and then they don't, but you can set them up so they don't do that. Even with that, it was taking, you know, when you leave the building, it was taking a really long time to find the GPS signal. I don't know why, we didn't really get down to the bottom of it.
Interesting. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons that
yeah. I can tell people what phones not to buy if they want GPS signal.
One thing I noticed in the data that you know, you saw the dip in the data when the children were in school, and then it rose again on their commute home, but then it stayed high overnight. Do you have any comments on why that might have been? Yeah,
we find that quite a lot. It's very difficult to know because we don't know what's going on. I mean, presumably children are at home by kind of 9 o'clock at night. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of sources of pollution in the home. So they could live with a parent that smokes. They could live with, could cook. It could be cooking fumes, things like that. I think there's just a lot more going on in the home environment that can lead to high levels of pollution. And I think it would be fascinating to do this, but focus on the home environment rather than focusing on the commutes. But you would need a lot of information from the children to interpret it. So you would need to know whether someone cooked a roast dinner or someone cooked, you know, did a stir fry or something like that, or if someone's got a log burner burning. We didn't collect any of that information, and it would be very time consuming to collect, but it would be very useful. So I suspect there's a really interesting study in the future somewhere around looking at children's exposure in the home and how behaviour can affect levels of air pollution. Because it's still very much, you kind of think air pollution, cars, buses, that kind of thing. Whereas actually, you don't think air pollution stir fry, do you? But actually, it is a really big source, especially home, like log burners and things like that. So we don't really know because we don't have the background to understand it, but I think it would be really useful.
You could probably do some kind of really interesting link study using like a Nest network or like Google Homes or something like that. That would be really cool. That would
be cool. So you need to find people that don't mind the invasion.
Another question from Claire Horwell, saying at the beginning of the talk you mentioned about people's perceptions of the greatest polluting hazards in their lives. For example, the fly tipping example. Can you talk a bit more about those interviews? Were these qualitative interviews, and what else did you ask?
So I should say I didn't do them. They were led by Bourne and Bradford. They were a mixed methods approach that they used. They did ask, they had a kind of structured series of questions that they asked each different group. But they were, as far as I understand, they were group based. So there was kind of like a script, but then obviously within a group discussion that can kind of go off. I can pop the link. I'll send you the link to the paper. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting paper.
Yeah, that would be really nice. We'll put that underneath the YouTube link, the YouTube webinar when it goes live. So yeah, if there are any other paper links that you want to put in there.
Yeah, well done.
So yeah, apparently the YouTube will be up in about 2 to 3 weeks. Chrissy had a question about that graph again. Obviously, you know, you showed us a graph and that's all we're focusing on. There was a monthly variation in pollution levels. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I mean, what we need to do is we need to look at the kind of the background concentrations which we can get from the time series of the purple layers. You do tend to get higher PM concentrations in winter. There's more sources, plus you have the inversion, and kind of tends to lead to higher concentrations. So that in itself is perhaps not surprising. It's quite weather dependent. In fact, I mean, if you look at how variable the time series is, if you remember the time series, it really does go up and down. And some weeks you can have low pollution, some weeks you have high pollution. So when you're doing portable monitoring for a short time, I mean, it's like taking a photograph in a time series. It's just a little snapshot of a small number of children in a big city against a moving background of concentrations going up and down due to the meteorology. So we haven't been able to kind of look at exposure before and after the clean air zone. I think, to be honest, we wouldn't have been able to anyway, because the background of pollution, just depending on what day of the week, but you know what the weather of that day, what the meteorology and the air pollution of that day is anyway, that you're going to have periods where you have high concentrations and periods that you have lower concentrations, just because that's the variability of air pollution. And so you really, if you want to do anything more significant, you need the longer time series. What you can do with the person exposure, obviously, is kind of look into activity and what people are doing and how that affects. But I think it's easy to forget how variable air pollution concentrations are day to day, and that really needs to be remembered. So what we'll do is we'll link our portable data to our static and just check it all makes sense.
We look forward to reading the results soon, I guess. Just a couple of final questions about the Homes Under the Microscopes project. So first, you're collecting your samples in a Petri dish. John wonders if that means you're biasing the results towards larger fibres, whereas are the smaller microfibres being airborne for longer and maybe you're not capturing those? What can you comment on the kind of sample biasing?
I mean, there'll be a bias in the fact that they're smaller, they're harder to see. I don't necessarily think there'll be a bias. I don't know, maybe my idea of it's oversimplified, but I just kind of imagine that the air that touches the Petri dish, anything that's in the air that touches the Petri dish should stick to the tape. Perhaps, maybe something very small can escape. We need to look at what our lowest detection limit is. There's definitely a bias in what people take photos of, because people take photos of the big fibres because it's a bit more interesting to look at. So what we're doing at the moment is we've got a student who has the fun job of looking at all the samples that have come back and doing it like in a grid square approach and taking a photo of each square. And we'll run that through the tool. And that will allow us to kind of count the number of fibres. There's also quite a lot of skill involved in identifying fibres through microscopes and things like that. So although our participants, have done a fab job, even the researchers that are used to looking at stuff on microscopes have gone on courses to kind of try and work out biases and things like that, and good ways of sampling. So we're aware that we need to do it in a scientifically rigorous way. But I think, you're right. It would be good to work out what the smallest particle would be and see if we can kind of correct for that.
Yeah, I think it's like you say, there's so little data published. You kind of have to start from scratch with your methods, and that's a really big challenge. So what next for that project?
So there's two things. Because there's so little data, and because it is like if we can get a good collection of microfibres with just a Petri dish and some forensic tape. I mean, literally, it's like £2 to make our little collection dishes. So you could imagine that you could spread that out to other places. We're working on something kind of around UV, because some plastics glow under UV. So we might try and count and see whether we can see what fraction is plastic just by using UV light. But I suspect we'll need the Raman to do the full analysis. But the other thing we're really hoping to do is to get it into schools. So again, through Bourne and Bradford have a project called the Age of Wonder, where we're tracking high school students, and they're looking at health and well-being and all those kind of things. But one of the things they're trying to do is get science, like genuine unknown science, into classrooms. So they're hopefully going to help us work with schools. And we thought we might just do something really simple, like get a pile of Petri dishes and put half of them around the school and half of them in people's homes, take them all back and get the kids to look at the sample and play with the visualization tool. And we really have no idea whether, I suspect concentration would be higher in the home than in the school because there's more textiles, but I don't know. But it's kind of it's an easy kind of project that could be, plus the kids get to play with microscopes, which is actually really good fun. So we can kind of do quite a lot of fun stuff around that as well. So that's the plan.
Awesome. And I think, you know, once you get some data in, like there's so many options for like machine learning and
exactly, yeah.
But that's a topic for another webinar. So that brings us to 12 o'clock. So it's time for me to let you all go. Thank you, Kirsty, for a really informative talk. Absolutely fascinating to hear both about the sensors and about the challenge of working with real subjects. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and thank you for coming along today. And keep an eye out for the advert for the next webinar. Which Critty, I wonder if you could give us some information about that, the next one in the series, and to remind you all to check out the YouTube channel for anything that you've missed. Thank you ever so much.
Lovely. Thank you, Kirsty, and thanks, Liz. That was really interesting.